You know, one of the things I cannot get myself to understand is why, despite the fact that we know that we are among the most disaster-prone countries in the world, we also continue to rank among the highest in terms of casualties and extent of damages to properties. We are visited by at least 26 typhoons every year. At least. We regularly experience earthquakes, floods, landslides, mudslides, volcanic eruptions, tsunamis, storm surges, and fires, especially in many communities in Malabon, Navotas, and Caloocan. And so every LGU is mandated by law to lay out its disaster risk reduction management plans and its programs routinely. At may budget pa yan. Malaking budget. And yet, whenever a calamity strikes, whether a natural one or a human-caused one, we always seem to get caught unawares. Today's gospel seems to offer an answer to my question about what aggravates disasters the most. And the answer is complacency. Complacency. In English, the term is generally negative in meaning, as opposed to the Tagalog, palagay ang loob. Alam natin, ang palagay ang loob can be both positive and negative. Actually, it is more positive than negative. We actually value ang pagiging palagay ang loob. Now, to give it the negative meaning, we qualify it with masyado. Nagiging negative pag masyadong palagay ang loob. Masyado kasing palagay ang loob niya. That's complacency for us. You know, we are often credited for being resilient on account of the fact that we are able to recover more quickly from calamities and disasters. And often, this is attributed to our being believers. We tend to submit too quickly to adversities, and we tend to assume an attitude that is fatalistic. But I sometimes wonder if it is correct at all to quickly refer to the disasters that are caused by calamities as God's will. Why should we accept too quickly that it is God's will that thousands of people be wiped out when, with just a little human intervention, the fatalities and damages can be either prevented or reduced? We have many expressions in English for what happens to people when they are complacent. Madaming mga expressions like taken by surprise, caught unprepared, overtaken or overwhelmed by eventualities, caught off guard, etc. One of the best biblical descriptions for complacency is found in the book of Daniel, chapter 12, in the opening verse. And it speaks about the coming of the end times. Let me quote. The verse says, "And there shall be a time unsurpassed in distress since the nation began until that time." It's talking about a disaster, a time of trouble, a time of calamity worse than any calamity ever been experienced by people. But may good news naman siya. It says, "But at that time, your people shall survive." The background to this is very obvious. The Noah's Ark story, which, by the way, Jesus is alluding to in the gospel, and which he presents as a model for disaster preparedness, despite the fact that only a few survived. And Jesus is also adding an allusion to the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah. And whenever I read the story in Genesis chapter 18 and 19, I get the feeling that the author is describing something similar to our experience in Pampanga, the Pinatubo eruption. And Jesus says, remember what happened to the wife of Lot. What happened? Well, she did not follow instructions. Nagbigay na ng instruction yung angel on disaster risk reduction. Pero hindi siya nakinig. She looked back. What adds to the tragedy of disasters is the fact that people have often been told or adequately warned about it. They could have come up with contingency plans, like Noah did. But they waited and waited until the last minute. And, of course, unfortunately, suffered the consequences. The gospel says there is no use trying to save properties. No use trying to save them at the last minute. Because there will be no time anymore to go down from the housetop. Na-experience namin yan sa Pampanga. When the lahar signal is anywhere between 3 to 5, huwag ka nang bababa. Just stay on your rooftop. So no time anymore to go down from the housetop. And no time anymore to return to the field and harvest, what you have planted. And, when the mud flow, when the lahar comes down, it can be as fast as 70 to 80 kilometers per hour. You can be overtaken by it. And it sounds like raging bulls, a very strong smell of sulfur. It is those who try to save things at the last minute who end up losing their lives. And I think that's what Jesus was suggesting when he said, those who save themselves will lose their lives. Our first reading seems to suggest where the sense of complacency is coming from. The writer of the book of wisdom is speaking about the foolishness, the stupidity of people who are unable to learn from experience. People who forget history too quickly. He speaks about people going astray, though they seek God and wish to find Him. He also says, and I quote, they search busily among God's works, but they are distracted by what they see, because the things that they see seem to be fair. Did it not seem like fair weather just a few hours before Typhoon Yolanda struck with fury? I remember there were even people saying, where is the typhoon? Because it was fair weather like this. Well, haven't we heard of people who even refuse to evacuate or to prepare for a disaster despite the warnings? By appealing to faith and religiosity, meron pang tipong magsasabing, hindi tayo pababayaan ng Diyos. God will not forsake us. Sometimes we may not realize that we might be using that pious line in a very blasphemous way. I sometimes wonder, when we suffer the consequences of complacency, if God does not feel like saying, hey, it was precisely because I care for you that I sent you experts who could warn you, but you refused to listen to them. I care for you, that's why I sent you prophets, but you refused to listen to them. Imagine a person who refuses to stop smoking even after being warned by his doctor. Sinabi na ng doctor, you know what? Mukhang meron ka ng tumutubong mass. You better stop smoking. And imagine the patient saying, si doc naman, hindi naman ako pababayaan ni Lord. Ang sarap batukan nung ganyan, di ba? No? Hindi ako pababayaan ni Lord. Hindi ka pababayaan ni Lord. Ikaw nga, pinababayaan mo sarili mo. Many of the tragedies caused by disasters could have been prevented or at least mitigated if only we use the intelligence that God has already endowed us with. Perhaps it is time to stop attributing to God what is often our own making or a product of our own negligence or complacency. You won't believe it, but despite all the scientific studies about global warming and all the international summits about it, despite Pope Francis's his alarm call in Laudato Si about the climate emergency, hindi na climate change, kundi climate crisis, climate emergency. Despite the actual experiences of unusually strong typhoons and radical changes in the weather patterns, despite the rising seawater level, there are government leaders who continue to deny the serious ecological crisis that we are already in. They would even go to the extent of calling ecological advocates as alarmists and lunatics who are anti-progress, anti-development. Well, we're ending our retreat, and I'd like to end by thanking our dear Good Shepherd sisters of Mary Ridge for hosting us in this beautiful retreat center. You know, after I looked at Taal Lake, and I mentioned that on the first day, I continued walking and I reached the garden next to the refectory. And there I saw a little sign put up by the sisters. And it says, and I'd like to end with it. I think it's a fitting conclusion to this sharing. When the last tree has been cut down, and the last fish eaten, and the last stream poisoned, it is then that you will realize that money cannot be eaten. Kapag ang huling punong kahoy ay nasibak na, at ang huling isda ay nakain na, at ang huling ilog ay nalason na, tsaka natin mauunawaan, ang pera pala hindi natin makakain.